Let's start by talking about radios. A pretty good idea. But having a good idea and selling a good idea are two different matters. When first introduced, and for a very long time, radios were large pieces of furniture until the transistor was invented, and transistors replaced the vacuum tubes in radios. The transistor radio is still one of the world's most common communication devices. A 2009 study estimated that there were 7 billion in existence around the world. The adoption of transistors into radios was a game changer. Some of the advantages included smaller devices, less energy required. They could operate on standard batteries, instant on, no vacuum tubes to warm up, and shock resistant. Well, smaller size, lightweight, and longer battery life were believed to give the transistor radio a clear market advantage over the old vacuum tube radios. Together, this created an opportunity for the first truly portable radio. Several companies competed to capture this market. In the US, we had Texas Instruments, Regency, Zenith, Bulova, and Emerson. In Japan, there was the Tsushin Kojo Corporation. Working together, Texas Instruments and the Regency Company released the first commercial transistor radio, the Regency TR-1 in 1954. The Tsushin Kojo Corporation saw an opportunity to enter the American market, and they brought their TR-55 to the United States in 1955. It was the first commercial success in the US. There would be many more, but not under that name. The founders of Tsushin Kojo Corporation, Ibuka and Morita, saw greater opportunity, but recognized the need for some changes. First, they recognized that their company name was difficult for Americans to pronounce. So they came up with the name Sony. They already had a product called the Sony tape, using the Latin word sonus, which is the root for sonic and sound. It also sounded like Sonny, a 1950s American expression suggesting young boys and youth. Additionally, Ibuka and Morita resisted great pressure from their principal bank to call the company Sony Electronic Industries. They didn't want to be connected to just one industry. Finally, breaking with a long-held tradition, Ibuka and Morita spelled their company name with Roman letters instead of Japanese characters. With these changes in place, Sony was almost ready to make its next big push into the transistor radio market. Next, they realized that they needed to reposition their transistor radio to make it distinctive. They needed to do so by introducing it as the first ever pocketable radio, or pocket radio. While true that their new model, the TR-63, was somewhat smaller, you still needed a very large shirt pocket to carry it. So, make it a bigger pocket. And this is exactly what several sources allege Sony did. Competitors at that time claimed that Sony's salesmen were outfitted with oversized shirt pockets that fitted the new pocket radio. Sony claimed, "We sell the smallest transistor radio in the world, and look, it's so small it will fit in your pocket." By 1959, more than 6 million transistor radios were sold by Japanese manufacturers, representing $62 million in revenue, helping to launch Sony as one of the world's most successful small electronics manufacturers. So, Sony was creative, to be sure, but their creative genius did not come with the ideation part of the creative process. They didn't invent the transistor. They bought the rights from Bell Labs. They weren't the first to invent the transistor radio. Not the first to make the transistor radios commercially available even. Sony's creative genius came in selling the idea. Creative in name change and their first positioning of the pocket radio. Let's remember where we are in the creative process, this universal creative process that we call creative problem solving. We're in the implement step of the creative process. At this point, we're doing three things. We're looking out to the context in which we will introduce our idea, our solution, or our change, and we're exploring it to make sure that what we're proposing will in fact be accepted. To help us with that, we create a plan, and then we put that plan into action. In the last lecture, we learned to create an action plan. Before you leap to action, you should check your environment for forces that will help or hinder your success. Sony recognized this. They recognized the need to change their name, for example. Psychologist Kurt Lewin indicated that proposed change will meet two forces, those forces that will help it to be successful and those forces that will hinder success. Wise action plans take these forces into consideration. As you go out to execute your idea, your solution, your plan, the change that you propose, it's best to anticipate resistance beforehand than to meet it head-on in the field. There's a tool that you'll learn in this lecture called assisters and resistors, which is a kind of way of doing a 360-degree force field analysis. It's using contextual thinking. It's putting ourselves into the future and examining our context and thinking about how will this idea be received. And it's using that kind of projection to influence our plan as we create it now, before we execute it. So let's look at assisters and resistors. Let's look at the steps within this tool. We begin by writing a summary of the proposed solution or the change so that it's clear in our mind what we wish to do. Then we diverge on sources of assistance and resistance. We create two columns or two areas to record all of the sources of assistance and all of the sources of resistance that we can think of. And as always, when you begin with this tool, it's important to engage in divergent thinking. We don't want to overlook a source that might assist us, that can help us to be successful. And we certainly don't want to overlook a potential source of resistance. It's better to anticipate it. To help us out, we use the 5 W's and the H to generate sources of assistance and resistance. As you may recall, the 5 W's and the H are who, what, when, where, why, and how. Each one of these words jogs our thinking to consider possible sources of assistance and resistance. Let's go through each one briefly and look at some questions and thoughts to consider as we explore assisters and resistors. So who? So as you think about the plan, what you wish to carry forward, this great idea that you're in love with, you want to make sure the world embraces it, we think about who? Individuals or groups who will either help or hinder us. Then we move to what? What are the things that might help or hinder us? When? Are there issues related to timing? Are there times where it's perhaps best to suggest or advance this idea, to put it into action? Are there times that should be avoided? Let's take that into consideration now. How about where? Physical or process locations that can help or hinder us as we try to advance this solution. Why? Why refers to reasons that might come up, reasons to support this idea, or reasons that others might come up with to block the progress of this idea. How, the H, how, refers to actions that others might take to either help you or get in the way, hinder, block your success as you move forward. In the third step, we select the most important sources of assistance and resistance. We converge, we prioritize, we make sure we zero in on those sources of resistance that we want to make sure that we call in to support us. And we identify the sources of resistance that are likely to resist us. In the fourth step of the tool, we generate action steps. We generate action steps that take advantage of the assisters. How can we leverage the assisters? We don't overlook the assisters and assume they're there to support us. Instead, we want to actively engage assisters. And we want to use our divergent thinking to also consider action steps to take to overcome the resistors. In some cases, it's using our assisters, perhaps leveraging our assisters to address some of the resistors. We then select the most important action steps, the action steps that we think will be most helpful as we've looked at our assisters and resistors, and then we create an action plan, much like we learned in the last lecture. We build out action steps along a timeline from immediate to short-term to intermediate to long-term. But this time when we create our action plan, it's fueled with this knowledge of those forces of assistance and those sources of resistance. Let's take a hypothetical situation. Let's take a fun scenario. Imagine suddenly you're appointed the czar of education. And let's take a playful idea. You decide that teachers should be replaced with project managers. It's an extreme idea, but it's being used only to take us through an example of how to apply this tool. So let's apply sisters and resistors to this idea. As the czar of education, you want to get others to adopt this idea of replacing teachers with project managers. Let's run through our assisters. So, who might help us with this? Who would be there to support this idea? Well, perhaps the Project Management Institute. This is the Professional Association for Project Managers. Maybe the states would be supportive. They might see this as an opportunity to save money. What are some things that might assist you? Well, there's this notion of problem-based education. And perhaps those who are proponents of problem-based education might see this as an opportunity to advance their own thinking. When? What are timing issues to take into consideration in terms of assistance? Well, perhaps it might be best to start this when students are seniors in high school and they perhaps have a little more flexibility and they've met the requirements for graduation. Where might we find assistance? Well, perhaps private schools and charter schools might be most open to this idea. Why? What are some reasons we can connect to? Well, there's an initiative in the US called the P21, Partnership for the 21st Century, which is a group of major organizations and educational thought leaders. And the skills that they talk about that are necessary for success in the 21st century, many of them connect to project management. So maybe a reason to support this would be that particular initiative. You can use that as a case to support pushing this idea forward. And then we come to H, the how. What are some actions that might be taken? Well, one how might be to look at well-known personalities. Get a big name proponent to be a spokesperson or a champion for this idea. Maybe Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, or Lee Iacocca. Now, we've looked at the sources of assistance. Those are forces that will help us. We also need to take into consideration sources of resistance. We'll run through the 5 W's and the H again, but this time we'll look at sources that will get in the way, that might impede our success. So we'll begin with who, the first W, who. Well, obviously teachers might have a concern with this. The schools of education and universities might take issue with this, as this will toss out their curricula. Boards of education might have an issue or concern about this. And the states, again, they might be too vested in their current system. Now notice, I included this for a specific reason. In some cases, and for different reasons, you can have the same item, the same variable, both as a source of assistance and as a source of resistance. But in this case, as we can see with states, for two different reasons. They might be a source of assistance in terms of they could see this as an opportunity to save with regard to budget, but they also might have a concern in that they're so invested in their current system, it's been built up, that there might be resistance to change. Let's look at what. What are actions or attitudes that might get in the way? Well, the entrenched view perhaps in the public, let's say, that teachers should remain as a sage in the classroom, dispensing knowledge. When? Well, it might be tough to advance this idea if you're the czar, if you have a limited budget. So during tough budgetary times, it might be difficult to move on this. Where? Where might it be challenging? Well, public schools have lots of demands on them, lots of responsibilities and regulations. So it may be difficult to implement this with public schools. Why? Why, again, explores reasons. Well, people might say it's too radical, it's too crazy, it's too far out there. It seriously challenges the current system, and it's too risky. We won't know if it's going to be successful. There's no track record. How? How are actions others might take? Well, perhaps here developers of standardized tests have a real stake in the current educational assessment practices. They might argue that this move would undermine standards and rigor in education. So we've gone through an example of assisters and resistors. I hope that this gives you a sense for how this works. Let's have you try this out. Let me take you through a very streamlined version of assisters and resistors, but now facilitate your own thinking as I walk you through this tool. Think about it in terms of your life. Begin by identifying something you wish to do in the next 6 months. Reflect on all your responsibilities, all your initiatives and projects. Think about one that is important to you, one that immediately comes to the forefront of your mind, something that you're committed to doing. And now let's take that through this tool, assisters and resistors. Generate some assisters and resistors in your own mind, quickly going through the 5 W's and the H as I did before. So who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who might help you? What are some things that might help you? Are there timing issues or location issues? Are there reasons you can use to support? Are there reasons that others might resist? Think about that quickly and allow your mind to now move towards a resistor. As you go through this framework, and especially as you think about resistors, is there one significant resistor that immediately comes to mind? Gosh, I really need to take this into consideration. This will really pose a challenge for me as I pursue this project or initiative. Focus on that resistor. And now ask yourself, what action steps can I take to address this resistor? Are there any sources of assistance that came to mind that might help you as you address this source of resistance? This was a very quick application of assisters and resistors, and we didn't spend time diverging on lots of sources of assistance, and we didn't comb through those sources of resistance. I had you immediately go to one immediate source of resistance. But I hope in that quick demonstration you found moving through that, even in a streamlined manner, that you found it helpful, that it gave you some sense for the value of anticipating sources of assistance and especially anticipating sources of resistance, as I had you just do, as you think about creating your plan, as you think about going forward. It's important not to just address one source of resistance. Let me be clear about that. When you converge on sources of resistance, you prioritize and you examine all of the important sources of resistance, and you generate ways to overcome action steps that will help to address all of the important sources of resistance. So you use this information to then create your final action plan. Let me tell you a story about Charles Kettering. At the beginning of the auto industry, it was dominated by one company and one car, the Ford Model T. That is, until General Motors drove the Model T into retirement. Well, how did that happen? Well, one reason was their head of research, Charles Kettering. He had a goal. His goal was to make cars consumers wanted. He believed consumers wanted cars that were efficient, comfortable, powerful, and driver-friendly. Boss Kettering, as he was called, was a prolific inventor. And this is important to remember, he was a massive practical joker. When he accepted the position as head of GM's new research division, he did so on the condition that he could work on 3 hand-picked problems. And the first problem he tackled was the painting process. You see, at this time, when cars were being produced, as a consumer, you had one choice in terms of the color of your car. That choice was black. There were no options. And Kettering believed that consumers would love to have cars in different colors. He thought they would like to have some degree of choice. Now, here's the other problem with the painting process at that time. You see, at that time, it took 37 days to paint a car. This was a huge bottleneck in the manufacturing process. The process was based on an old paradigm. It was based on how carriages were painted, layer upon layer of paint, with lots of time in between to dry. Kettering wanted to eliminate this bottleneck. So he gathered the painting unit and he challenged them to reduce the time. They went away, they thought about it for some time, and they came back and they said, "Boss, we've been thinking about this. And after close examination, we believe we could get the painting process down to 30 days. Kettering said, "That's not exactly what I had in mind. I was thinking more of an hour." The painting boys were completely shocked. They went away to give it some more thought, and Kettering went away as well. It's said that he was on a trip to New York City when he had an aha moment. He was walking along in New York City doing some window shopping when he looked through the window and a small pillbox that was beautifully painted caught his eye. He went into the store and talked to the manager and asked about the production process behind that pillbox. And he was told that if he wanted to find out about that process, that he should go talk to the developer who lived out in New Jersey. So he went out to visit the craftsman, and the craftsman showed him the kind of paint he was using. He was using lacquer paint, and he described how the lacquer paint had some advantages, like drying quickly. "Aha," Kettering said, "drying quickly." So he got together with DuPont, and he shared this lacquer paint, and he asked DuPont if they could find a way to thin it out enough so that it could be sprayed on. After some time, they were successful. Now Kettering had his solution. He had his breakthrough. Now, was that enough? He went to the painting unit again and he shared the idea, and you can imagine their response. Did they warmly embrace it and celebrate Kettering? No, they said, "We've invested too much infrastructure into our current process. It would be too costly to make this change," so they absolutely resisted the idea. Now remember, Kettering was a practical joker. So he took the head of the painting unit out to lunch one day. And as they were having lunch, Kettering tried again to convince him of the value of his idea. And sort of idly, as they were having discussion, at one point he happened to ask the head of the painting unit, "What's your favorite color?" And he told him his favorite color, and they carried on having their conversation. At the end of the lunch, Kettering still had not convinced this man. So as a gentleman, he got up with him and he said that he would walk him out to his car. So he escorted the head of painting out to his car, whose jaw dropped when he saw his car. Now remember, during that lunch, Kettering had asked him his favorite color. During lunch, Kettering had a team paint the head of the painting unit's car in his favorite color. Well, you know the rest of the story. Shortly after that, they established a prototype line and they tested this idea, and then it became the industry standard. You see, people resist even brilliant ideas. Imagination used to generate ideas, that's great, but we also need to use imagination to convince others to accept our ideas. Kettering used his imagination to convince a critical stakeholder to accept his idea. Sometimes it's not the brilliance in generating the idea that makes a difference in terms of our success. It's the imagination we use to sell the idea that allows us to achieve success. Here's a deliberate tool that helps you in a way to kind of think like Kettering. It's called stakeholder analysis. It's designed to identify the key people that will support or hinder the success of any given solution, plan of action, or a desired change. The way it works is we identify and examine the positions of people or groups who have a stake in the plan. We look at how these people might affect the outcomes, and then we decide where they need to be in order to support the desired change. And then we devise a set of actions aimed at gaining support from these key players. So here are some questions. How do you know who the key stakeholders are? Here are some questions that might help you to identify these key individuals that you need to take into consideration. Who's affected by the plan or the proposed change? Who has an interest in the plan and its outcomes? Who can affect the plan's adoption or implementation? Who might express discontent to what is being proposed? Who can shape or influence the opinions about the issues involved? Who have clear roles in the plan? Once you've identified your stakeholders, we can move through this tool. So we begin by diverging on a list of key stakeholders. We can use the questions that I just read. We select the key stakeholders and then we list them in the first column of a 6-column chart. For each stakeholder, we have to then identify where are they now? Where do we believe they are now in regard to this proposed plan? Are they strongly opposed? Are they moderately opposed? Are they neutral? Are they moderately supportive? Are they strongly supportive? We mark the position with an X. For each stakeholder, we identify where we need them to be as well. Now we know where they are. But we now need to consider, in order to go forward, do we need to move them along? So where do we need them to be in regard to the proposed plan? And we mark this position on our worksheet with an O. We connect these two, the X and the O, where we believe they are now and where we need them to be. We connect those 2 points with an arrow to represent the position X, where they are, and how far we have to move them to get to where we need them to be. This helps us to then move to the next step in this tool, which is to list the actions required in order to gain support for the implementation of your plan. And then we include those actions later in our final plan. Let's look at an example. Let's imagine you're in a corporation and you've decided you want to implement this idea. You want to take a team and you want them to operate as internal facilitators, people who will conduct creativity intervention sessions, sort of like a SWAT team, a creativity SWAT team. They're going to use creative problem solving to run interventions to tackle business challenges or challenges within your organization. So we identify our stakeholders and we converge on our stakeholders. And let's say our stakeholders, the ones that we consider to be the most important, are the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, the Chief Operating Officer, the COO, the Chief Financial Officer, the HR Director, the Union President, mid-level managers, and supervisors. We then identify, using an X, where they are currently relative to this idea of creating an internal team of creativity facilitators. Let's say the CEO is someone who's familiar with this idea and he's supportive. Let's say he's moderately supported or she is moderately supportive. Through discussions, we know the COO is moderately opposed. The CFO is in the same place. The HR director, a close colleague of yours, you know that he or she is really on board and strongly supportive. The union president, neutral. Mid-level managers, neutral. They're very busy. It's not something they tend to give a lot of thought to. And supervisors, your sense is that supervisors might be moderately opposed. The X represents where they are now. Now we ask ourselves, where do we need these stakeholders to be in order for this plan to be successful? Well, we recognize that the CEO really needs to be an outspoken advocate. We really need him or her to be strongly supportive. We also recognize that with other executives like the COO or the CFO, that if we don't get them on board, the idea is not likely to be successful. So we need to move those two also forward from moderately opposed to moderately supportive. Now, the HR director is already strongly supportive. We don't want to ignore that. We want to keep that in mind. The union president, we know that we need to get him or her on board, and we need that person to be strongly supportive. With mid-level managers, we need to move them from neutral to moderately supportive. Supervisors, we need to move them from moderately opposed to neutral. Now, we go through looking at the distance that we need to move these stakeholders, and we generate required actions. So the CEO, how do we move him or her along? Well, we could show the value of creative problem solving by conducting high-level training for executives. The CEO, we could provide examples of operational innovation. The CFO, demonstrate return on investment. And we continue generating action steps for each of these stakeholders. Now, when it comes to the HR director, we might need to leverage his or her support. He or she is already strongly supportive, but we don't ignore this person. How do we take advantage of that as we look at our action steps? So once we've gone through the stakeholder analysis, we begin to look at how that can enhance our action plan. And in this way, much like a sisters and resistors, our action plan is informed by going through this kind of analysis. And it should, as a result, strengthen our action plan. This lecture focused on ways to get our proposed solutions and change accepted. I encourage you to practice stakeholder analysis. You started on an initiative to consider the things that you need to do. You might try stakeholder analysis or sisters and resistors and complete those tools on that particular project, initiative, or solution you want to take forward. See how this thinking helps to influence your plan. Will it help you to better sell your idea? Remember, it not only takes imagination to create a novel idea, but also takes imagination to sell it. And if Peter Senge is right when he said, people don't resist change, they resist being changed, then it may take more imagination to sell people on the reasons to accept your proposed change. To do this, we can be guided by another quote, this time from Robert Vanderpool, who said, "The most successful businessman is one who holds onto old ideas as long as it is good, and grabs for the new just as it is better." In such cases, you may need to act like Charles Kettering, using imagination to show others that better has arrived.